Welcome back to SquashWarp in Kerbal Space Program. On our last mission, we had a major staging accident during orbital insertion at the moon that ruined our mission. So we are launching the same, or an identical copy of that spacecraft on an improved booster. We're now using a pair of liquid-fueled booster rockets, which get much better specific impulse even in the atmosphere, and get us substantially more delta V, as well as more control. We've got two non-gimbling engines on the outside, one gimbling engine in the center, and I'm not doing any fuel lines because if we were to have a completely full center stage when those side boosters burn out, ooh, that was very nice, we would end up with a very low thrust-to-weight ratio. So we move on to the final stage for the orbital insertion of Kerbin right away after dropping those boosters. Again, I always remark on those beautiful real plume effects. And this time, see, we've got the same fairing. This time we're going to be mindful that the fairing can destroy our spacecraft if we are not paying attention to what we are doing. And it's actually not even the fairing, it's just me being confused by how the staging works. So we are going to right-click deploy that fairing just so we have no confusion. And we're going to time accelerate to our apoapse burn. And we've seen this before, this tortoise spacecraft, and it's called that. Well, it's called that because that was the next reptile on my list of reptiles, but it was a bit of actually the name, which I looked up first, became the inspiration for the vehicle to have a heat shield on top. I never got a chance to talk about what this spacecraft is intended to do, because it got wrecked before I had a chance to talk about that. But this is a sample return mission. It's got all of the science that we currently have the capacity to do, and we're going to land it on the moon. And we don't need landing legs. We don't have landing legs. We're not worrying about that. We're just going to touch down on the engine bell because that seems safe. And then we're going to fly back to Kerbin, and that heat shield, and there's a couple of there's 4 tiny fins surrounding the probe core and the science package and a pair of parachutes. And between those different safety features, that very top of the spacecraft will be able to return back to Kerbin safely. At least that is the hope. But first we got to get to the moon. And so doing our same old warp to the sphere of influence change and then slowly time accelerate until we cross over that boundary, as if this was still an old version of Kerbal Space Program where our orbit got completely messed up when we crossed the sphere of influence. Everything works so much better these days, doesn't it? I'm realizing that my delta V readout was not giving me the information I thought it was. And not worrying about maneuver nodes, we're just going to manually burn radially because we don't actually want to hit the moon just yet. We're going to lift our periaps so that it's just above the surface, so that we can safely do a braking burn and come into a nice orbit so we can pick our landing site. Because we went to all that effort to scan the moon with our ScanSat radar altimeter thing, and we're not going to actually look at the map in any way at all, but we can pretend that we need to pick our landing site, right? And coming down, we're just going to do a quick burn at our periaps, circularize our orbit for the most part, and we have already progressed much more successfully on our mission than we did the last time. So I built a little node just so that I can see where that maneuver marker is going to be, because we are going to be on the far side of the moon when we do this burn. What I want to do is bring my periaps down so we're right above the surface of the moon, but we will not have probe control. And so I've pointed us at our marker, and all I've got is Z and X. So I just tap real quick, and we get our maneuver. We overburn slightly, but it's close enough. We're going to come in very shallow over the surface of the moon. At this point, we've got so much delta V because we haven't even gone on to our final stage yet. And this upper stage of the vehicle, which is the one that's actually going to land on the moon, should have an excess of delta V to get us down and bring us home safely. So we're getting within 7 kilometers of the, lowest parts of the moon now. So it's time to ditch that stage, burn out what's left and ditch it, and move on to our actual lander craft. It's very long and tall, and You'd think after, starting over again and rebuilding the launch vehicle, I would have remembered to put the landing legs on that stage, but I never got far enough in the previous mission to notice that we were missing them. But it doesn't matter. Like I said, we're just going to land on the engine bell and find out what biome we're in. It looks like we're going to be landing in the Midlands, which is fine. The Midlands are kind of everywhere. I find that I always end up in the Midlands if I'm not trying to go somewhere else. So we're just going to come gently down, and I actually accidentally hit the Windows key instead of the X key, and so we ended up floating up into the air on a low thrust while I was frantically trying to find my game tab again. But we've landed on the moon. Hey, we soft landed a probe on the moon, and we didn't even use landing gear. And before we even have a chance to celebrate, we're off again. Now here is where I make an interesting decision. I say, I can't get enough of this science. This science is so great. We're going to get so much science from this mission. We're going to go over to the nearby crater biome and find out what we can discover in there. We've already used our materials bay science. Ooh, a moon arch. Who put an arch on the moon? Squad did, but we won't talk about that. But we are going to land in this other biome and get a little bit more science out of it because we can. And because I am getting really greedy. Now, if I'd been paying any attention to my Delta V readout, since, I put it there, I put all that work into making that heads-up display with Kerbal Engineer, you'd think I would use the readout, but I just got really excited about all the science we could get. And, I'm saying I did it, but, it's the Kerbals in Mission Control, right? They're so excited to have science. And the science that you can go find right now is better than the science that you hope to get later if nothing else goes wrong, right? So after visiting our second biome, we are off to go into orbit, and here is where I'm looking at the numbers and realizing this isn't going to work. I build a node to see if it's even possible to get into an orbit with only 270 something meters per second left, and it's not. It's not even possible to get into a stable orbit, and I'm hoping that the kick we're going to get when we actually decouple that upper stage intentionally this time might get us stable, but it doesn't look like it's going to work, and I decide we've just got to dump the science. It's better to get the science returned, to actually bring it back and recover it on the surface of Kerbin, but the science that you transmit at a reduced rate is better than the science that you lose in a fiery explosion on the moon, which... Why there would be fire on the moon, I don't know, but the explosions are fun regardless. So, frantically trying to build up enough electric charge so that we can dump all of the remaining science before this second tortoise mission has to abandon the rest of its craft. See, this thing is so cute. Wouldn't have this thing would have been so fantastic going down through the clouds of Kerbin. Or perhaps it would have flipped upside down and immediately incinerated itself because I never actually tested it. I'm going to skip ahead to the moment where we actually hit the ground, because at this point we don't have any connection back home. I can't do any maneuvering, but our first encounter with the surface of the moon is actually fascinating. It's really dark, and I should get that ambient light enhancement mod. But the heat shield exploded, and we bounced. We hit the ground like, several hundred meters per second, and nothing is left. But the good news is, after going back to the Space Center, revert flight. I don't want to revert flight. This was way too dramatic to revert flight. We finally go back. We can unlock those last two nodes of this tier, which are all from the Surface Bases mod. And that means I can set an alarm for myself for 10 days when I can start unlocking nodes on the next tier of the tech tree. I just pop back to make sure I got all my, that I actually did get all of the nodes. Set up my timer. And then we're ready to move on to something else. We're gonna, whoa, where is the atmosphere? Forgot about that. Moving on, Elsted Kerman, our favorite test pilot, is in a new death vehicle. I mean, a new spaceplane concept that he's trying to experiment with, and he's pulling up as hard as he possibly can. But this plane does not seem to have the control authority. I turn up the authority on those little flaps, It does not help, and we are careening into the surface of the ocean. We've got no fuel left, and I cannot control it, so it's time to bail out. He's struck by the wing. Can he deploy his parachute? And he does, but the aircraft is destroyed in a giant splash. Those EVA parachutes are quite nice, though. So now Elsted has to swim back to base. But he does, and then a few days later, we are launching a new and improved version of that same concept. This time we use a solid rocket booster to help us get up to altitude, forgetting to bring in the landing gear, apparently. This thing can fly much better once we get up a little bit of speed. It can make some hard banking turns. It has very good control authority. Those fins up on the nose mean that if I'm not careful, I can just flip the thing over endwise because it has so much pitch control. So I got to be careful. The good news is, with when it's empty of fuel, this thing can land at under 40 meters a second, and it's just very safe if you have a flat runway. So this design leads us to the K-20 Galahad. My take on the premise of the dinosaur that they were working on creating back in the early era of spaceflight, which was meant to be a lifting body reusable vehicle that they launched on top of a rocket. This is my version. It's not a lifting body, it just has wings. And I figure, hey, a bunch of solid rocket boosters theoretically are less expensive to throw on there than to build a whole liquid fuel rocket that gets thrown away. So this still gets points for reusability and gives me permission to launch my spaceplane more often than my rockets, which will enable us to start doing things in the interim while we're waiting for our weekly launch window. I say launch window, it's just my arbitrary time limit. So after we had those 4 solid rocket boosters at the beginning and 1 gigantic booster to get us up to high altitude, and then I have these 2 external tanks, and after almost losing control as we flip over to fly in a non-inverted state so that he's not hanging upside down now that we're done with our gravity turn, we're using one of those KW rocketry upper stage engines. It's got more thrust and better ISP in the atmosphere than the LV909, and it's a bit heavier, but that actually serves our purpose as well. It brings the center of mass closer to the back of the craft where we can actually attach the wings. Because if you'll notice, there's Modular Rocket Systems Light still has those nice cargo bay parts, but you can't surface attach on the outside of them. So our wings can only be attached in the back, and it's important that we keep our center of mass close to the back. But hey, this thing has enough delta V to get into orbit, and so we time accelerate to our maneuver node and then perform our circularization burn. And partway through, we can drop off those extra drop tanks, and they will fall back into the atmosphere, and I assume they will burn up. But now that we're circularized, let's go see what happens to those tanks. They're very light, so there's a chance they'll survive this because they just decelerate so quickly with the air resistance. There's temperature gauges, and wow, it has completely changed direction, but then is immediately destroyed in the ocean. We will assume that the other tank met a similar fate. And now it's time to switch back to Elsted, who is patiently waiting for us in his spaceplane. No doubt popping open a bag of celebratory snacks. Although, while we have successfully gotten into orbit, we still need to return, and we only have 5 hours of life support, so it's time to get on with the mission. We have 2 cargo bays here, and inside is an actual payload. This is the Turtle spacecraft, not to be confused with the Tortoise, which seems to have been jinxed somehow. But after pushing our little spacecraft out of our payload bay, Elsted gets to go on EVA, mostly because he gets a ribbon for it in Final Frontier, but also to make sure that there was no damage to the spacecraft as it was jostled around inside the cargo bay. I switch over to the spacecraft, which has a probe core and totally didn't need to be manned, but don't tell Elsted because he wanted to fly it. I switch it over so that it's easier for him to get into the plane. And now it's time to try to land this thing. Our spacecraft that we have deployed is self-sufficient. We just need to put that relay antenna out and make sure that we have connection back to the Kerbal Space Center. And then it's time to set up a return burn. Now, I have always struggled a bit with space planes, and if Elsted were to die, I'd be faced with the difficult decision of figuring out whether or not I want to do a revert to save a big mistake, which I haven't actually had to do yet. So, fingers crossed that everything goes okay, because I don't want to have to make that decision when his life hangs in the balance. Now, we've brought our periaps down to about 35 kilometers above the space center, and that's much more conservative than we would do with a capsule. We would want to overshoot, and we'd want to burn a little bit more and have our periaps be lower, but this thing can fly. So we're going to be taking advantage of the fact that we have wings on our spacecraft and flying into the sunrise. I've switched into 2 times time acceleration because things are starting to happen faster. We have a bunch of fuel that we need to move forward, or we're going to be aerodynamically unstable. But better yet, we could dump the fuel, and we of course won't be able to burn the engine if we need some extra boost, but I think it's going to be more useful to be lighter and perhaps be slowed down by atmospheric drag more efficiently, because right now that extra mass could kill us. It's nice to know that we overbuilt this plane, because it means we could potentially bring a larger payload into orbit and still have enough delta V to get there. And this is when we start hitting the aerodynamic re-entry heating effects, and I'm seeing that capsule start to glow red. It's making me very nervous. Elsted seems like he's having the time of his life, but I think he's about to explode. We pitch up as far as we can. Oh, and the temperature gauge comes up, and we need to lower our vertical speed, and in fact we want to bounce off the atmosphere right now because we're far too deep and we're going far too fast. This is orbital speeds at a pretty dense part of the atmosphere, and I'm fighting with my pitch controls and using the RCS thrusters to try to give me an extra boost. But we don't want to completely miss the Kerbal Space Center, but not dying would still be preferred. If we can get to the Space Center, great, but living Kerbal and intact spacecraft is more important, unsurprisingly. Well, now that our vertical speed has become positive, we're actually skipping up out of the atmosphere, I start to do some side bank braking maneuvers to try to slow us down while our vehicle heating isn't so intense. We want to skip across this little intervening ocean and end up in the continent with the Kerbal Space Center, which we should be able to do assuming we don't die. It used to really matter that you made it to land and did not try to land your vehicle in the water because the water physics would kill you, but now it doesn't matter so much. Although the atmosphere is still very capable of killing us, even though we have made it down to under 30 kilometers. Elsted flaring as hard as he can and even using the RCS to boost up, which I don't know how effective that is, but it enables us to get through the re-entry effects, and now it's just a question of gliding down at Mach 3 back to the Space Center. We have way too much energy coming in, but the good news is we can pull these hard banking maneuvers because Elsted doesn't care. 10 Gs, it's just a walk in the park. We set the little flag that Elsted Kerman left for us when he was doing his job application process so that we can point directly for the runway on our nav ball. And at this point I've slowed time back down so I can commentate without having to stop myself from taking any breaths. We're still moving so fast, Elsted needs to actually do an entire turn just to bleed off some speed and get us down below 200 meters per second. And we have much more control over the vehicle now. Makes it a bit twitchy, actually. But if we can safely land this craft on the runway or otherwise, it will be a successful mission. And we even deployed a payload, so it was not just a test flight. As we come in, we still have a lot of speed. Remember, this thing can glide forever when it's empty. We want to get down to like 30 meters per second, and we don't have the time to do it. But we're lined up. No time for a toga maneuver. We don't have enough energy. We're going to need to flare hard and come down to the runway regardless of what our touchdown speed is. Luckily, Elsted can deploy our final component of this design, our drogue chutes and our brakes slow us down to a complete stop. And hey, it's a complete mission and no deaths. And my first try for coming back to the Space Center. So I am quite happy. Elsted, of course, he's always happy. He's a Kerbal. Does a little jump and poses for the camera. Now let's go back to that spacecraft that we deployed in our very functional mini space shuttle mission. This is the turtle probe. We had to rename it. It's not the Galahad relay. It is the turtle space probe. And I spend some time messing around with the maneuver nodes, but nothing is really in the right place. I'm going for Eve for a little while, but with all of our 7-day launch windows, we've pretty much missed our Eve for this rotation. And I take a look at Moho. I actually even get an encounter, but I realize I don't have the Delta V for it anyway. And then I realized that I don't have a relay that is capable of talking to the planets that are that far, or at least I'm not certain if it is. So instead of aiming for anything in particular, we just move on and go ahead and do a burn to put us into interplanetary space, because we could use the science just from being in a solar orbit. Unfortunately, this probe, even though it is tiny and should have plenty of reaction wheels in that little probe core, it's actually unbalanced. I think it must be that relay antenna, and it's very difficult, even while we're doing the burn on this little teeny ant engine, it's very difficult to keep ourselves actually pointed at the maneuver node. And the burn is about 5 minutes long. It would have been quite easy and simple to put a better engine on this thing. I thought the ant would be a fun little cute effect there, but future iterations, if I do this same design, could benefit from having a bit more thrust. The only science experiment that we can't bring with us is that Science Junior, because it is a 1.25 meter part and our cargo bay is currently only 1.25 meters wide. But we're going to head off to interplanetary space and hopefully learn something new about the nature of the Kerbal universe. But we'll have to find out what in a future episode. Thanks for joining me for SquashWarp.